Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Marcus Vale stared at the worn leather journal in his hands, its pages yellowed with age and experience. At 42, he looked older than his years, crow's feet etched deep from squinting into darkness, hands scarred from encounters most people wouldn't believe. He wasn't your typical hero. No cape, no badge, no official title. Just a man who'd stumbled into a world that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. Growing up in suburban Phoenix, Marcus had lived the American dream in miniature. Strip malls, air conditioning, and endless summer heat. His mother worked as a dental hygienist. His father managed a Home Depot. They weren't wealthy, but they made it work. While other kids played video games or shot hoops, Marcus buried himself in books, particularly the dusty volumes tucked away in the back corners of the library. Urban legends, cryptid sightings, unexplained disappearances. The librarians thought he was just another weird kid with morbid interests. They had no idea he was training for his life's work. College at Arizona State seemed like the natural progression. He double majored in anthropology and pre-med, drawn to both the historical mysteries of human culture and the clinical precision of medical science. His professors saw potential, maybe as a researcher, maybe as a doctor working with indigenous communities. Marcus saw it differently. He was building a toolkit for something he couldn't yet name. The awakening came during his junior year. A family in a small desert town outside Tucson had contacted the university about strange occurrences. Livestock found drained of blood, geometric patterns burned into their property, and sightings of something that moved like liquid shadow through the mesquite. The anthropology department dismissed it as local folklore mixed with grief over recent droughts. Marcus volunteered to investigate for extra credit. What he found in that desert changed everything. The family wasn't dealing with folklore. They were living with a nest of creatures that predated human civilization, ancient things that had learned to adapt, to hide, to feed on isolated communities where nobody would look too closely. Marcus barely survived that first encounter, but it opened his eyes to a truth that most people spent their entire lives ignoring. Monsters were real. They lived alongside humanity, hidden in plain sight, and someone had to keep the balance. That someone, it turned out, was part of a network called the Institute, a shadow organization that operated through a loose confederation of researchers, hunters, and government contacts. They found Marcus before he found them, showing up at his apartment 3 days after the desert incident with credentials that seemed to exist only when convenient and resources that suggested funding beyond any official budget. Dr. Elena Vasquez became his handler, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd been tracking supernatural incidents for 2 decades. She explained the Institute's mission in clinical terms: monitor, contain, and when necessary, eliminate threats to human civilization that fell outside conventional understanding. They weren't monster hunters in the Hollywood sense. No dramatic confrontations or over-the-top weapons. They were more like specialized exterminators dealing with problems that required very specific expertise. Marcus spent the next 20 years building a reputation within the Institute's ranks. He developed a methodology that combined academic research with tactical precision. Where other hunters relied on force or traditional folklore, Marcus approached each case like a dissertation defense: exhaustive research, careful observation, and surgical execution. His success rate was impressive, but more importantly, he rarely lost civilians. Now, decades later, he was documenting his experiences for the Institute's archives. The journal would eventually find its way to the underground library in Montana, where future hunters might learn from his mistakes and successes. It was a tradition among the Institute's veterans: pass along what you've learned, because the next generation would need every advantage they could get. The world was changing. The creatures were becoming more aggressive, more coordinated. Traditional hunting grounds were shifting as climate change and human development disrupted ancient territories. Monsters that had remained hidden for centuries were being forced into contact with expanding human populations. The Institute was struggling to keep pace. Marcus opened the journal to the first blank page and began to write. The call came through Dr. Vasquez on a Tuesday morning in October. Marcus had been tracking a series of disappearances in the Pacific Northwest, hikers vanishing from well-traveled trails, leaving behind only shredded backpacks and marks that suggested something far larger than any native predator. The trail had gone cold after 3 weeks, and Marcus was considering filing the case as unresolved when his secure phone buzzed. The mission parameters were straightforward. A family camping in the Appalachian Mountains had reported their 9-year-old son taken by something they described as a giant. Local law enforcement had found evidence supporting their story: footprints, damaged vegetation, and witness testimony that couldn't be explained by conventional means. The Institute needed someone with Marcus's field experience to assess the situation. Marcus arrived at the ranger station as the sun was setting behind the mountain peaks. The building looked like something from a postcard. Log construction, stone chimney, American flag hanging limp in the still air. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with barely contained panic. The child's parents, Robert and Linda Chen, sat huddled together on a wooden bench, their faces hollow with the kind of exhaustion that comes from hours of helpless terror. Ranger Captain Mike Torres, a weathered man in his 50s with premature gray hair and the steady demeanor of someone who'd seen too much, briefed Marcus on the situation. The Chen family had been camping on the Ridge Trail, a popular 4-mile loop that wound through some of the park's most scenic areas. Their son Tommy had been collecting wildflowers near their campsite when his father turned away to start their camping stove. When Robert looked back, his son was gone and something massive was crashing through the underbrush. The description matched nothing in North American fauna: 9 feet tall, humanoid, but wrong in fundamental ways. Gray skin with a texture like tree bark, disproportionately long arms, and hands large enough to palm a basketball. Most significantly, it had moved with intelligence, not the random aggression of a wild animal, but the purposeful action of something that understood exactly what it was doing. Marcus examined the scene as darkness settled over the mountains. The campsite told a clear story: a family enjoying a peaceful evening interrupted by something that shouldn't exist. Tommy's collecting jar lay shattered near the tree line, surrounded by footprints that pressed deep into the forest floor. The tracks were unlike anything in Marcus's extensive database: too large for human, too structured for bear, and following a pattern that suggested the creature was consciously avoiding areas where it might be spotted. Following the trail required every technique Marcus had developed over 2 decades of hunting. The creature was heavy but moved with surprising grace, leaving broken branches and scraped bark at intervals that suggested it was comfortable navigating dense forest. More concerning was the evidence of intelligence. The tracks deliberately avoided clearings where they might be visible from the air, and the creature had chosen a route that would make pursuit difficult for anyone without specialized tracking skills. After 3 hours of careful pursuit, Marcus heard the sound that confirmed his worst fears: a low, rhythmic humming coming from somewhere ahead. The sound was hauntingly beautiful in its way, like a lullaby sung by something that remembered melody but had forgotten why music mattered. It was the sound of a troll preparing to feed. Trolls were among the most dangerous creatures in the Institute's files, not because they were particularly aggressive, but because they were smart enough to be methodical. They didn't kill impulsively. They collected prey, stored it, and took their time. A troll that had taken a human child would keep it alive for days, savoring the terror before finally feeding. It was a race against time that Marcus had lost before. The troll's lair was a carefully constructed pit, hidden behind a tangle of roots and moss, about 10 feet wide and 6 feet deep. The creature had lined it with stones and decomposing leaves, creating a natural prison that would be nearly impossible to escape without assistance. Tommy Chen sat at the bottom, his hands bound with vine rope, his face streaked with tears and dirt but mercifully alert. The troll itself was even more impressive in person than the eyewitness accounts had suggested. 13 feet tall and built like a cross between a gorilla and a construction worker, it sat on a boulder overlooking its prison, methodically sharpening its claws on a piece of granite. Its skin had the texture of old concrete, weathered and cracked but incredibly durable. Most unsettling were its eyes, not the wild animalistic stare of a predator, but the patient, calculating gaze of something that had learned to plan ahead. Marcus's field kit was designed for surveillance and research, not combat. He carried a variety of specialized tools, motion detectors, night vision equipment, sample containers, and documentation cameras, but only basic defensive weapons. His most powerful offensive tool was a deployment net infused with wolfsbane extract, designed to incapacitate rather than kill. The Institute preferred capture and relocation when possible, both for research purposes and to avoid creating power vacuums that might attract worse creatures. The rescue required precision timing and a deep understanding of troll behavior. Marcus positioned himself upwind from the creature, knowing that trolls had excellent hearing but relatively poor night vision. He activated an emergency flare and threw it into a pile of dry brush on the opposite side of the clearing. The explosion of light and sound sent the troll into a panic, covering its sensitive eyes and ears while stumbling away from the perceived threat. Marcus used the distraction to rappel into the pit, cut Tommy's restraints, and lift him out in a single fluid motion. The child had the presence of mind to remain silent and cling tightly as Marcus carried him toward the tree line. The wolfsbane net, deployed with the accuracy of years of practice, caught the troll across the shoulders and chest. The chemical reaction was immediate. The creature's movements became sluggish, its coordination failing as the botanical toxin interfered with its nervous system. The retreat through the forest was a careful balance of speed and stealth. Marcus knew the wolfsbane would only incapacitate the troll temporarily, and other creatures in the area might be attracted by the commotion. He carried Tommy in a fireman's carry, using game trails and natural cover to avoid detection, while making steady progress toward the ranger station. The reunion at the ranger station was everything Marcus had hoped for and dreaded. Robert and Linda Chen's relief was overwhelming. They clutched their son as if he might disappear again, whispering thanks to Marcus that he deflected with professional distance. Tommy himself seemed remarkably resilient, talking excitedly about his adventure while his parents struggled to process what had happened. Marcus's report to the Institute was clinical and thorough. He documented the troll's behavior, its apparent intelligence, and the concerning fact that it had established a hunting ground in an area where trolls had never been recorded. Dr. Vasquez's response was immediate and troubling. Similar displacement incidents were being reported across North America. Creatures were showing up in regions completely outside their traditional territories, suggesting some kind of mass migration or territorial disruption. The Institute's research division was already developing theories. Climate change was forcing creatures from their ancestral habitats. Urban development was destroying traditional hunting grounds. Most concerning was the possibility that something else, something larger and more dangerous, was displacing the creatures that humans had learned to coexist with. Marcus received a formal reprimand for engaging without backup, but Dr. Vasquez's private message was more supportive. The Institute needed hunters who could think independently and act decisively. The bureaucratic protocols that worked for routine cases would be insufficient for whatever was coming. 3 years after the Appalachian incident, Marcus found himself in New Orleans for a rare personal occasion. His college roommate Jake Morrison was finally getting married, and Marcus had promised to serve as best man. It was a chance to step away from the Institute's work, to remember what normal human life felt like, to eat good food and listen to music without wondering what supernatural forces might be lurking in the shadows. New Orleans had always been a favorite destination for Marcus, though his professional obligations meant he'd visited more often than he'd preferred. The city existed at the intersection of multiple cultures, multiple histories, and multiple realities. Magic wasn't hidden in New Orleans. It was part of the architecture, woven into the music, celebrated in the streets. The Institute maintained a permanent research station there, disguised as a folklore preservation society, because supernatural incidents were so common that they barely registered as unusual. Marcus was enjoying his second day of vacation when Dr. Vasquez's message arrived on his encrypted phone. The text was brief. Local asset requesting immediate consultation, personal referral, discretion advised. The address led him to a jazz club in the Marigny district, a neighborhood that existed in the spaces between the French Quarter's tourist attractions and the city's working-class reality. The club was small, intimate, with a stage barely large enough for a quartet and tables that had been carved by decades of carved initials and wine stains. During the day, with the lights up and the music silent, It felt like any other small business struggling to survive in an economy that didn't value artistry. The woman waiting for him at the bar was someone Marcus recognized by reputation. Celeste Thibodeau was a local legend, a jazz vocalist whose voice could stop conversations and start romances. She was in her early 30s, with the kind of presence that came from years of commanding attention without demanding it. When she spoke, her voice carried the subtle accent of someone who'd grown up speaking French and English with equal fluency. But something was wrong. The voice that had been compared to honey and smoke was barely above a whisper, and her movements carried the careful precision of someone conserving energy for basic survival. She kept a silk scarf wrapped around her neck, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd encountered something beyond their understanding. Celeste's story unfolded in fragments, interrupted by moments when her voice failed entirely. 2 weeks earlier, she'd been approached after a performance by a man who claimed to be a talent scout from a major record label. He was charming, sophisticated, and offered opportunities that seemed too good to be true. They'd talked for hours, not about contracts or money, but about music itself, about the power of the human voice to convey emotion and meaning. She'd felt comfortable with him, trusted him in a way that surprised her. He'd asked her to sing for him just a few bars of her favorite song, and she'd complied. The performance had felt different, more intimate, more revealing than anything she'd done on stage. When he'd left, she'd felt energized, inspired, ready to take her career to the next level. The voice problems started the next day. First, she'd lost her upper register. Notes that had been effortless suddenly felt impossible. Then her middle range began to fade, replaced by a harsh whisper that bore no resemblance to her natural voice. Medical examinations revealed nothing wrong. Her vocal cords were healthy, her breathing was normal, and her throat showed no signs of injury or infection. But every night she lost a little more of herself. The man had returned twice, each time asking her to sing again, each time leaving her weaker than before. She'd stopped performing, stopped seeing friends, stopped doing anything that might reveal how completely she'd been diminished. The scarf around her neck wasn't a fashion choice. It was camouflage, hiding the fact that she could barely speak above a whisper. Marcus recognized the pattern immediately. Sirens were among the most insidious creatures in the Institute's files because they appeared so human, so harmless, so helpful. They'd evolved beyond their ancient role as shipwrecking seductresses, adapting to modern life by becoming talent scouts, music producers, and industry executives. Instead of luring sailors to their deaths, they harvested artistic ability from willing victims who thought they were getting career opportunities. The process was gradual and seemingly voluntary. The siren would identify someone with exceptional talent, approach them as a potential mentor or patron, and gradually extract their abilities through a series of seemingly innocent performances. The victims rarely understood what was happening until it was too late, and by then they were too diminished to resist. Marcus's field kit included several items specifically designed for siren encounters. A small vial of seawater collected from a location he'd learned not to name, blessed by someone whose credentials existed only in the Institute's classified files. A silver-framed mirror that reflected truth rather than appearance, and a collection of phrases in a language that predated human civilization, words that could compel supernatural creatures to reveal their true nature. The confrontation came that evening, just as Marcus had expected. The siren arrived at the club as if he owned it, walking through the locked front door with the casual confidence of someone who'd never encountered meaningful resistance. He was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of generic handsomeness that suggested he'd chosen his appearance for maximum appeal rather than personal preference. Marcus stepped between the siren and Celeste, making his presence known without immediately revealing his intentions. The creature's reaction was subtle but telling. A moment of stillness, a slight narrowing of the eyes, the careful assessment of a predator encountering unexpected competition. The siren's voice was everything Marcus had expected, smooth, compelling, designed to inspire trust and compliance. He spoke about contracts and opportunities, about Celeste's untapped potential, and the mutual benefits of their arrangement. The words carried supernatural weight, designed to override rational thought and encourage cooperation. Marcus responded by throwing the blessed seawater at the siren's feet. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The creature hissed and stumbled backward, its carefully maintained human appearance flickering like a television with poor reception. The seawater reminded it of its true nature, disrupting the illusion that allowed it to pass for human. The silver mirror completed the revelation. As Marcus held it up and spoke the ancient words, the siren's reflection showed its true form, emaciated, elongated, with the predatory features of something that had evolved to hunt in deep water. Its fingers were too long, its mouth too wide, its eyes too dark and too hungry. The banishment was anticlimactic compared to the revelation. The siren, exposed and weakened, lost its hold on the physical world and dissolved into mist and memory. The stolen voice returned to Celeste gradually, starting as a whisper and building to her full, magnificent range over the course of several hours. Marcus's report to the Institute focused on the siren's adaptation to modern hunting methods. Traditional sirens had been territorial creatures, tied to specific locations and hunting grounds. This one had shown remarkable mobility and sophistication, suggesting an evolution in their predatory strategies. Dr. Vasquez's response included a disturbing addendum. Similar cases were being reported in music scenes across the country, suggesting a coordinated effort rather than isolated incidents. The Institute's supernatural threat assessment was being updated to reflect the new reality. Creatures weren't just adapting to human expansion, they were learning to exploit human institutions and systems. The monsters were getting smarter, more sophisticated, more dangerous. Marcus spent his last day in New Orleans at the club, listening to Celeste perform for a small audience of locals who understood that they were witnessing something special. Her voice was stronger than ever, carrying notes that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of the building. When she finished her set, she found Marcus at the bar and embraced him with the fierce gratitude of someone who'd nearly lost everything. As he walked back to his hotel through the humid night air, Marcus reflected on the changing nature of his work. The monsters were evolving, adapting, learning to exploit human weaknesses in ways that traditional hunting methods weren't designed to address. The Institute would need to evolve as well, developing new strategies and training methods for a generation of hunters who would face challenges that Marcus's generation had never imagined. The letter arrived at the Institute's Phoenix office on a Tuesday in late summer, written in careful cursive on stationery that felt substantial in a way that suggested it had been saved for important occasions. The envelope was addressed to the people who handle strange things, with a return address from rural Nebraska. Dr. Vasquez forwarded it to Marcus with a brief note. Might be your kind of case. Requester specifically asked for someone with agricultural background. Marcus's undergraduate work had included a focus on agricultural anthropology, studying how different cultures developed farming practices and how those practices shaped their supernatural beliefs. It was the kind of specialized knowledge that seemed irrelevant until suddenly it wasn't. The letter was signed by someone named William Garrett, a farmer who'd worked the same land for 3 generations. His writing was economical, precise, and carried the authority of someone who'd learned to observe carefully and speak truthfully. The problem was simple. Something was wrong with his land, something that couldn't be explained by drought, disease, or poor soil management. Marcus drove to Nebraska in his modified pickup truck, a vehicle that looked like standard contractor equipment, but contained a mobile laboratory disguised as tool storage. The drive took him through landscape that embodied the American heartland, endless fields of corn and soybeans, farmhouses that had weathered decades of economic uncertainty, grain silos that stood like monuments to human persistence. The Garrett farm was a substantial operation covering several hundred acres of prime agricultural land. The farmhouse was a classic 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and a barn that had been expanded and modified over the years as the operation grew. William Garrett himself was a man in his 60s, tall and lean with the kind of weathered skin that came from a lifetime of outdoor work. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and his manner suggested someone who'd learned to be skeptical of easy answers. The problem became apparent as soon as Marcus saw the affected area. In the middle of the farm's most productive field, a perfect circle of dead earth stretched 20 feet across. The soil inside the circle was gray and cracked, completely devoid of vegetation. More disturbing was the way the dead area seemed to repel life. No insects, no birds, no microorganisms visible even under magnification. Garrett's description of the affected area's development was methodical and precise. The problem had started as a small patch of discolored soil, perhaps 3 feet across, that had appeared overnight. Over the course of a week, it had expanded to its current size while becoming increasingly barren. Attempts to irrigate the area had failed. Water simply ran off the surface without penetrating the soil. Tools brought into contact with the affected earth had become brittle and broken. More concerning were the secondary effects. Livestock avoided the area instinctively, sometimes becoming agitated enough to break through fencing rather than graze nearby. The farm's dogs, normally curious about any changes to their territory, refused to approach within 50 feet of the circle. At night, the area seemed to generate its own weather patterns. Localized fog that appeared regardless of atmospheric conditions, and temperature variations that suggested the soil itself was either absorbing or radiating heat. Marcus's initial examination revealed traces of supernatural activity consistent with several possibilities. The soil samples showed chemical compositions that shouldn't exist naturally, including mineral formations that required extreme pressure and temperature to create. Electromagnetic readings fluctuated wildly within the affected area, suggesting the presence of energies that didn't conform to standard physics. The breakthrough came when Marcus researched the property's history. The Garrett farm had been in the family for 3 generations, purchased from a larger agricultural corporation in the 1920s. Before that, the land had been part of a much larger operation that had failed during the economic upheavals of the early 20th century. But the original records, dating back to the 1800s, revealed a more complex story. The land had originally been settled by a family of German immigrants who'd established a successful farming operation using techniques that seemed remarkably advanced for the era. Their success had attracted attention from neighboring farmers, but also suspicion and resentment. The historical records were incomplete, but newspaper accounts from the 1890s suggested that the family had been accused of using supernatural methods to ensure their crops' success. The accusations had escalated into violence. One winter night, a group of local farmers had attacked the German family's homestead, killing several family members and burning their house and barn. The survivors had fled the area, but not before cursing the land itself, ensuring that anyone who profited from their family's suffering would eventually face supernatural consequences. Marcus recognized the pattern immediately. Land curses were among the most persistent and dangerous forms of supernatural contamination because they were tied to specific locations and fueled by historical injustices. Unlike creature-based threats that could be eliminated or relocated, land curses required careful ritual cleansing that addressed the original source of the supernatural contamination. The cleansing ritual required 3 days of continuous effort, working from sunset to sunrise when the spiritual barriers between the physical and supernatural worlds were thinnest. Marcus established a ritual circle around the affected area, using salt, iron filings, and blessed water to create a protective barrier. The ceremony itself involved elements from multiple traditions: Native American smudging techniques, European folk magic, and modern ceremonial practices developed by the Institute's research division. The first night produced minimal results. The second night brought a response. The temperature within the affected area dropped 20 degrees, and the ritual circle was tested by something that manifested as pressure rather than physical presence. On the third night, the land itself seemed to exhale, releasing decades of accumulated spiritual toxicity in a way that was both visually dramatic and emotionally overwhelming. The cleansing worked, but the process revealed something that Marcus found deeply troubling. The curse hadn't been dormant for over a century. It had been growing, feeding on the accumulated guilt and suffering of everyone who'd farmed the land without acknowledging the original injustice. The supernatural contamination was stronger than historical records had suggested, and it had been actively seeking an opportunity to manifest. More concerning was the evidence that similar cases were increasing in frequency across the agricultural heartland. The Institute's files contained reports of cursed farmland, contaminated water sources, and supernatural incidents tied to historical injustices that had been ignored or forgotten by local communities. The pattern suggested that America's expansion westward had left a trail of supernatural contamination that was beginning to manifest as the original participants died and the memories of their actions faded. Marcus's report to the Institute included a recommendation for a comprehensive survey of agricultural supernatural incidents, particularly in areas with histories of violent displacement or cultural conflict. Dr. Vasquez's response was swift and concerned. The Institute's resources were already stretched thin dealing with creature-based threats, and land-based supernatural contamination required specialized expertise that few hunters possessed. The conversation with Dr. Vasquez that followed was one of the most significant in Marcus's career. She explained that the Institute was facing a crisis that went beyond individual cases or regional threats. The supernatural ecosystem that had maintained a delicate balance for centuries was breaking down, and the creatures that humans had learned to coexist with were being displaced or corrupted by forces that the Institute didn't fully understand. The recruitment program that Marcus had been supporting was being expanded from a gradual transition to an emergency response. The Institute needed hunters who could adapt to changing circumstances, who could work independently when traditional support systems failed, and who could train others quickly and effectively. Marcus's combination of field experience, academic background, and teaching ability made him an ideal candidate for the program's leadership. The conversation ended with an assignment that would define the rest of Marcus's career. Establish a training facility for the next generation of hunters, develop curriculum that could prepare them for threats that didn't exist in traditional folklore, and create a network of regional specialists who could respond to supernatural incidents that were becoming too numerous for the Institute's current resources. 5 years after the Nebraska incident, Marcus stood in the Institute's new training facility in Colorado, watching a group of recruits practice basic supernatural threat assessment. The facility occupied a former military base that had been decommissioned and quietly transferred to the Institute through channels that existed only in classified documents. The buildings had been modified to simulate various supernatural encounter scenarios, and the surrounding wilderness provided opportunities for field training that couldn't be replicated in urban environments. The recruits were different from Marcus's generation. Younger, more technologically sophisticated, and more willing to accept the existence of supernatural threats as part of the world's basic operating parameters. They'd grown up with the internet, with global communications, with access to information that previous generations had struggled to obtain. What they lacked was the hard-won experience that came from years of surviving encounters with creatures that violated every assumption about how the world worked. Dr. Vasquez had been right about the acceleration of supernatural incidents. The Institute's case files showed an exponential increase in reported encounters over the past decade, with creatures appearing in locations and circumstances that defied traditional patterns. More concerning was the evidence that the creatures themselves were evolving, developing new hunting strategies, and adapting to human countermeasures with alarming speed. The troll incident in Appalachia had been part of a larger pattern. Traditional creatures were being displaced from their ancestral territories by something that the Institute's research division had designated as apex displacement events. The specifics varied by region, but the pattern was consistent. Ancient, powerful creatures were moving into areas where they'd never been recorded, forcing smaller predators into contact with human populations. The siren case in New Orleans had been even more troubling. The creature's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and modern social structures suggested an evolution in predatory behavior that went beyond simple adaptation. The Institute's files now contained reports of sirens operating as talent agents, supernatural entities establishing modern business operations, and creatures that had learned to exploit human institutions for their own purposes. Most disturbing were the land-based supernatural incidents. The cursed farm in Nebraska had been one of dozens of similar cases across the American heartland, suggesting that the country's history of territorial expansion and cultural displacement had created a network of supernatural contamination that was beginning to manifest as the original participants died and the memories of their actions faded. Marcus's role had evolved from active hunter to strategic coordinator. He still took field assignments when his specific expertise was required, but most of his time was spent training new hunters, developing response protocols, and trying to understand the broader patterns that were reshaping the supernatural landscape. The Institute itself was changing. The loose network of researchers and hunters that had operated in the shadows for decades was becoming a more formal organization with government backing and military support. The change was necessary. The scale of supernatural incidents was beyond what a small group of specialists could handle. But it came with costs that Marcus found troubling. The new recruits were being trained as operatives rather than scholars. They learned to identify and neutralize supernatural threats efficiently, but they weren't encouraged to understand the creature's behaviors or motivations. The Institute's traditional approach of coexistence and containment was being replaced by a more aggressive strategy of elimination and territorial control. Marcus understood the necessity of the changes, but he worried about the long-term consequences. The supernatural ecosystem had maintained a delicate balance for centuries, with creatures and humans occupying different niches and avoiding direct conflict. The new approach risked destroying that balance entirely, creating a state of permanent warfare between human civilization and the supernatural world. The journal had become Marcus's way of preserving the Institute's original mission and values. Each entry documented not just the technical details of supernatural encounters, but the human cost of the work and the moral complexities of deciding which creatures deserved protection and which posed unacceptable threats to human welfare. As Marcus watched the recruits practice tactical formations designed for supernatural combat, he reflected on the path that had brought him to this point. The boy who'd read dusty books about monsters in a Phoenix library had become a man responsible for preparing the next generation to face creatures that were evolving faster than human understanding could adapt. The future remained uncertain, but Marcus was committed to ensuring that the Institute's institutional knowledge survived the transition. The journal would eventually join the archives, where future hunters might learn from the experiences of those who'd come before. The work would continue, carried forward by people who understood that the darkness had always been there, waiting, and that someone had to stand guard against it. The mountains of eastern Tennessee held their secrets close, wrapped in morning mist and the kind of silence that made city folk nervous. I'd been tracking something through these hills for 3 days, following reports of livestock disappearing and strange lights moving through the valleys after midnight. The locals called it the Hollow Men, though none of them would say much more than that when pressed. I'd set up camp near a creek that ran cold and clear down from the ridge. The water tasted of minerals and old stone, the kind of flavor that reminded you these mountains had been here long before humans ever set foot on them. My fire crackled softly in the gathering dusk, casting dancing shadows on the trees that surrounded my small clearing. The first sign of trouble came with the absence of normal night sounds. No crickets, no owls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the creek murmuring over its rocky bed and the occasional pop of burning wood. In my 23 years of hunting monsters, I'd learned that silence was often the loudest warning you could get. I'd been reading through my field notes when I heard it. A sound like wind through dry leaves, but there was no wind. It came from the direction of the old logging road, the one that curved up the mountainside and disappeared into a stand of dead pines. The locals had warned me about that road, said it led to places where the sun never seemed to shine right and the air tasted of copper and decay. The sound grew closer, and I realized it wasn't wind at all. It was whispering, dozens of voices speaking in unison, words I couldn't quite make out but that made my skin crawl nonetheless. I doused my fire and grabbed my pack, checking that my silver-loaded pistol was within easy reach. Whatever was coming, I didn't want to meet it sitting by a campfire like some tourist on a weekend getaway. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Then I saw them emerging from the tree line, figures that moved with an odd, gliding gait, their forms indistinct in the darkness. They wore what looked like old-fashioned clothing, overalls, work shirts, and boots that had seen better decades. But something was wrong with their proportions, as if they'd been stretched or compressed by an unseen hand. As they drew closer, I could see that their faces were the worst part. They had all the right features, eyes, nose, mouth, but they were arranged slightly wrong, like a photograph that had been torn apart and reassembled by someone who'd never seen a human face before. Their skin had a waxy, translucent quality, and their movements were too fluid, too graceful for creatures that should have been bound by the same physical laws as the rest of us. I counted 7 of them, moving in a loose formation through the trees. They didn't seem to have noticed me yet, but I knew that wouldn't last long. These things, whatever they were, had the look of predators, and I was the only prey for miles around. The hollow men were a new addition to my bestiary, something I'd only heard whispered about in the darkest corners of hunter gatherings. They were said to be the spirits of coal miners who died in the mountain's depths, trapped forever in the tunnels that had claimed their lives. But the stories were fragmentary, contradictory, and I'd never put much stock in them until now. Watching them move through the forest with their unnatural grace, I realized the stories had gotten at least one thing wrong. These weren't the spirits of dead miners. They were something else entirely. Something that had merely borrowed the appearance of the men who'd once worked these mountains. The real miners were long gone, their bodies claimed by cave-ins and gas explosions decades ago. What remained were these hollow shells, animated by something that had never been human to begin with. They paused at the edge of my clearing, their malformed heads turning in unison toward where I crouched behind a fallen log. One of them raised its hand, and I saw that its fingers were too long, jointed in places where no human joints should be. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of wind through empty tunnels. The words weren't in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood their meaning. They were asking questions. Who was I? What was I doing in their territory? Did I know the price of trespassing on sacred ground? There was something almost courteous about their inquiry, as if they were genuinely curious about my presence rather than immediately hostile. I stayed silent, hoping they might lose interest and move on. But one of them, the tallest of the group, stepped forward and tilted its head in a way that reminded me of a bird studying a worm. Its eyes were like holes punched through black paper, and looking into them gave me the uncomfortable sensation of staring into an abyss that was staring back. The creature raised its hand again, and this time I felt a pulling sensation in my chest, as if something was trying to draw the breath from my lungs. The air around me grew thick and cold, and I realized with growing alarm that I was having trouble breathing. Whatever these things were, they could manipulate the very atmosphere around them. I had to act fast. Drawing my pistol, I aimed for the center of the tall creature's chest and fired. The silver bullet struck home with a sound like breaking glass, and the thing staggered backward, its form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. But it didn't fall. Instead, it seemed to solidify, becoming more real and substantial than before. The other hollow men turned their attention to me fully now, and I could feel their collective gaze like a physical weight. They began to move forward, their gliding steps carrying them across the clearing with impossible speed. I fired again and again, each shot finding its mark but failing to stop their advance. That's when I remembered something from my early training. Some creatures weren't weakened by silver, but rather strengthened by it. The bullets weren't harming them, they were feeding them, making them more real, more dangerous. I holstered the pistol and reached for the emergency flare in my pack. The red light exploded across the clearing, and the hollow men recoiled as if they'd been struck. Their forms wavered and became translucent, and I heard them make a sound like steam escaping from a pressure valve. They didn't flee, but they stopped their advance, hovering at the edge of the light's reach. I had a moment to think, to process what I was seeing. These creatures were tied to darkness, to the deep places where light never penetrated. They were strongest in the tunnels and caves that riddled these mountains, but up here in the open air, under the stars, they were vulnerable. The flare wouldn't last long, but it might give me enough time to reach higher ground. I backed toward the steep slope that led up the ridge, keeping the flare between me and the hollow men. They followed, but cautiously, staying just outside the sphere of red light. Their whispering had resumed, but now it had an angry edge to it, like the sound of wind through a graveyard. As I climbed, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The coal mining operations in these mountains had been abandoned for decades, but the tunnels remained, a vast network of artificial caves that honeycombed the earth. Something had taken up residence in those tunnels, something that had learned to mimic human form but had never quite mastered the art of being human. The hollow men weren't spirits of the dead. They were something much older, something that had been sleeping in the deep places until the miners had awakened it with their dynamite and machinery. They'd learned to wear human faces like masks, but underneath they remained as alien and unknowable as the darkness that birthed them. I reached a narrow ledge about 50 feet up the slope and turned to look back. The hollow men had stopped at the base of the cliff, their upturned faces pale in the dying light of the flare. They seemed to be waiting for something, though I couldn't imagine what. That's when I heard the sound of engines in the distance, the low rumble of heavy machinery echoing through the valley. At first I thought it might be a mining operation, but then I remembered that all the mines in this area had been closed for years. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper in the mountains, from the direction of the old company town that had been abandoned when the last mine shut down. The hollow men heard it too, and their behavior changed immediately. They began to move with greater urgency, gliding back toward the tree line with their unnatural grace. But before they disappeared entirely, the tall one turned back to look at me one last time. Its mouth opened, and I heard my own voice speaking words I'd never said. It was repeating something I'd told a fellow hunter years ago, during a case in West Virginia. A private conversation about the nature of evil, about how some monsters were born from human cruelty, while others were older than humanity itself. The creature had somehow plucked the memory from my mind, and now it was using my own words against me. The message was clear. They knew me, or at least they knew what I was. They'd been watching, learning, preparing, and whatever was happening in the abandoned mining town, it was part of something much larger than a simple haunting. I waited until the sound of the engines faded before climbing down from the ledge. My flare had burned out, but the stars provided enough light to navigate by. I needed to get to higher ground, to a place where I could see the entire valley and figure out what was really going on. The hike to the ridge took most of the night. The trail was treacherous in the darkness, winding through stands of mountain laurel and over rocky outcroppings that crumbled underfoot. More than once I had to stop and listen for signs of pursuit, but the hollow men seemed to have vanished as completely as they'd appeared. By dawn I'd reached the fire tower that marked the highest point for miles around. The structure was old and rusted, but it still looked solid enough to climb. From the observation deck I could see the entire valley spread out below me like a three-dimensional map. The abandoned mining town sat in a natural depression about 5 miles to the east, its empty buildings clustered around the skeletal remains of the old tipple. But something was different about the place now. There were lights in some of the windows, and I could see vehicles parked in what used to be the company store parking lot. Someone had moved into the ghost town, and I had a feeling it wasn't just squatters looking for free housing. I spent the morning watching the town through my binoculars, taking notes on the patterns of activity. There were people moving around, real people, not the hollow shells I'd encountered the night before. They wore modern clothing and drove late-model trucks, and they seemed to be conducting some kind of operation in the old mine buildings. Around noon, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A group of the hollow men emerged from one of the mine entrances, moving in their characteristic gliding motion. But this time, they weren't alone. They were accompanied by humans, real humans who seemed to be giving them orders. The two groups moved together toward the town, disappearing into one of the larger buildings. I'd seen enough. Whatever was happening in that valley, it was bigger than a simple monster problem. Someone was working with the hollow men, using them for purposes I could only guess at. And if my suspicions were correct, I was looking at the early stages of something that could spread far beyond these mountains. I made my way back down the fire tower and started the long hike toward the abandoned town. The route would take me through some of the most dangerous terrain in the region. Narrow ridges, deep hollows, and stretches of forest so thick that sunlight never reached the ground. But I had to know what was really going on, even if it meant walking into a trap. The approach to the town took most of the afternoon. I moved carefully, using game trails and ridgelines to avoid detection. The closer I got, the more evidence I found of recent activity: tire tracks in the mud, cigarette butts, and empty food containers that hadn't been there long enough to weather. By late afternoon, I'd reached a position on the hillside above the town where I could observe without being seen. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The operation below was sophisticated and well-funded, involving at least 20 people and enough equipment to outfit a small army. They'd set up some kind of laboratory in the old company store, and I could see people in hazmat suits moving in and out of the building. But the most disturbing sight was the mine entrance itself. They'd installed modern equipment there: generators, ventilation systems, and what looked like some kind of containment apparatus. And every few hours, groups of the Hollow Men would emerge from the depths, escorted by armed guards to one of the buildings in town. I was watching a harvest operation, I realized. Someone was collecting the Hollow Men, studying them, and possibly trying to replicate whatever process had created them in the first place. The implications were staggering. If they could mass-produce these creatures, they'd have an army of beings that could move unseen through the world, mimicking human appearance while serving their master's purposes. As the sun began to set, I knew I had to get closer. The information I'd gathered so far wasn't enough. I needed to know who was behind this operation and what their ultimate goal might be. But first, I had to contact the Institute and let them know what I'd found. I made my way to a secure position about a mile from the town and set up my satellite communication equipment. The message I sent was brief but urgent. Large-scale operation in progress, unknown entities being harvested, immediate backup required. The response came back within minutes. Backup en route, maintain surveillance, do not engage until support arrives. But as I packed up the communication gear, I realized that waiting for backup might not be an option. The activity in the town was increasing, and I could hear the sound of heavy machinery starting up in the mine. Whatever they were planning, it was reaching a critical phase. I made my decision. Moving under cover of darkness, I began the dangerous descent toward the abandoned town, knowing that I might be walking into a situation that was far beyond my ability to handle alone. But sometimes, when the stakes are high enough, you have to take risks that would normally be considered suicidal. The monsters I'd spent decades hunting were bad enough when they occurred naturally, but the thought of someone creating them deliberately, turning them into weapons, was something I couldn't allow to happen, even if it meant sacrificing my own life in the process. The mountains of eastern Tennessee kept their secrets well, but some secrets were too dangerous to remain hidden. And as I made my way toward the lights of the abandoned town, I knew that whatever I found there would change everything I thought I knew about the war between human and monster. The darkness ahead held answers, but it also held dangers that I was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in those depths, the Hollow Men were waiting, their borrowed faces turned toward the surface, ready to begin their harvest of the living world.